Imagine a situation that would make the palms of any self-defense expert instantly break into a sweat. You are in the center of a crowded, buzzing like a beehive, terminal at Tokyo's Haneda Airport, surrounded by thousands of people rushing for their flights. Suddenly, this noisy world ceases to exist, shrinking to the size of a single deadly trap. The date is November 16th, 1971, and the air is thick with the smell of jet fuel and expensive tobacco. But Bruce Lee, standing in the middle of the hall, senses a completely different scent, the scent of inevitable violence. Towering over him, blocking the flight information board, is a 140-kilogram mountain of flesh and muscle. This isn't just a street thug. It's the reigning judo champion of Japan, a man who has dedicated his entire life to the art of turning gravity into a weapon of murder. In his world, the world of wrestlers and grapplers, there exists one brutal axiom that knows no exceptions. If a striker allows a grappler to get close and secure a grip, the fight is over. The striker is dead. And right now, before the eyes of a stunned delegation of martial arts masters, this law of physics is coming into force with ruthless inevitability. You probably think Bruce Lee managed to jump away? That he took his famous stance and let out a battle cry? That is the beautiful lie we see in the movies. The reality was blunt, fast, and humiliating. The giant didn't waste time talking. He lunged forward with a hand like a bear's paw, and with a sickening sound like a whip crack, his fingers snapped shut on Bruce's clothes. This wasn't a friendly pat on the shoulder. It was a dead grip, steel pincers, from which it is impossible to escape if you weigh 2.5 times less than your opponent. The judoka jerked his hand up, and Bruce Lee, the great dragon, the icon of power, suddenly found himself in the position of a helpless doll. His heels left the floor, and he hung in the air, held up only by the strength of his garment's fabric. To understand the sheer horror of this second, you need to look away from Bruce's calm face and look at what lies between the giant's fist and the legend's neck. This is our dagger, the tightly stretched, creaking from monstrous tension, collar of a trendy leather jacket. Look at this piece of leather closely. It's bursting at the seams. It's digging into Bruce's throat, cutting off the carotid artery. This collar is the only thing currently keeping Bruce upright, and at the same time, it's a noose slowly choking him. The judoka holds him so confidently, so masterfully, that a Santa Barbara effect occurs, flipping the viewer's consciousness. We are used to seeing Bruce in control, but here he looks like a victim caught in a snare. Physics is relentless. When 140 kilograms of mass control your center of gravity and your feet don't touch the ground, you cannot strike. You cannot generate power. You are luggage that a porter is about to hurl onto a conveyor belt. Ask yourself honestly, what would you feel seeing that smirk on the giant's face? The judoka is smiling because he knows what comes next. He has already calculated the trajectory. In his head, the script is written to the end. Now, he will take a step in, pivot his hip, and execute a harai goshi throw that will slam Bruce Lee into the terminal's concrete floor with the force of a falling meteor. At such weight and amplitude, this throw won't just knock the wind out of him, it will snap his spine. This isn't sparring, it's a public execution of a striking style. The giant looks into Bruce's eyes and sees his victory. He sees the end of the myth of invincible kung fu. "Well, actor," reads his gaze, "where are your cameras? Where are your wires? What will you do now that I hold your life in my fist?" The tension in the hall reaches its peak. The people around have frozen, waiting for the sound of breaking bones, and no one, absolutely no one, including the judoka himself, notices the microscopic shift in the hanging Bruce's posture that will, in a heartbeat, turn a triumph of strength into a catastrophe of anatomy. Let's dissect the anatomy of this execution so you understand why no bookie in the world at that second would have bet a plugged nickel on Bruce Lee. The judoka, this leviathan in a kimono, wasn't just holding him. He was preparing a classic, lethal move, harai goshi, a sweeping hip throw. From a physics standpoint, it works like a giant catapult, using his pelvis as a fulcrum and his 140 kilograms as a counterweight. He was about to launch Bruce's body along an arc that would end with the back of his head hitting the concrete. The giant knew Bruce was a striker, and a striker needs distance, leverage, and space to maneuver. By depriving the dragon of the ground beneath his feet and pinning him close, the judoka was certain he had defused the bomb. He looked into Bruce's face with that smug smirk that appears when a man realizes he has total control over another's life, and his eyes held a silent question for the crowd. "So, where is your kung fu now?" "Well, actor," he growled, his hot, heavy breath hitting Bruce's face. "What will you do now, without your retakes and editing? Try to hit me, and I'll break your neck before you can even clench your fist." This wasn't an empty threat. The overstretched collar of the jacket was already digging into Bruce's throat, cutting off oxygen, and every moment of delay brought hypoxia and loss of consciousness closer. At this moment, the viewer expects Bruce to struggle hysterically, to try to break free, to knee him in the groin, or gouge his eyes, to do anything dictated by a cornered beast's survival instinct. We are used to thinking that salvation lies in flight, that one must break the distance at any cost. But here, the Santa Barbara effect takes over, shattering the patterns of your perception and making you doubt the reality of what's happening. Bruce Lee did not struggle. He didn't strike. He did something absolutely paradoxical, something that contradicts the survival logic of any normal person. Instead of pulling back to free his neck, he leaned forward. He stepped, as much as was possible while hanging, right into the monster's embrace, closing the distance from critical to zero. For a split second, the judoka was stunned. His brain, tuned for the victim's resistance, glitched. He expected Bruce to pull in the opposite direction, creating the necessary leverage for the throw. But Bruce, becoming water, flowed into his personal space, destroying the structure of the technique from within. Ask yourself honestly, if a bear grabbed you, would you step into its paws? It seems like madness, like suicide. No, Bruce Lee, at that moment, wasn't thinking like a victim. He was thinking like an engineer of the human body. He knew a secret inaccessible to the understanding of raw force. The tighter the contact, the fewer opportunities for momentum the opponent has, but the more access you have to his pressure points. Entering the clinch, Bruce didn't surrender. He took the ideal position for a counterattack that the judoka didn't even suspect. The giant thought Bruce was looking for support to avoid falling, but in reality, Bruce was using the enemy's body as a map on which he had already marked the target with an X. The dragon's face remained terrifyingly calm. His muscles were relaxed, but inside that relaxation, a trigger was already being cocked, ready to fire at the very second the giant began the pivot for the throw. It was a trap disguised as submission, and the 140-kilogram champion, without knowing it, was holding in his hands not prey, but his own death, which was simply waiting for the perfect moment to show its teeth. In that fraction of a second, when 140 kilograms of living rage surged into motion, triggering the throw mechanism meant to smear Bruce Lee across the terminal floor. Time at Tokyo's airport didn't just slow down, it collapsed into a single ringing, vacuum-sealed point of no return. The giant tensed his thighs, his torso began to pivot, creating a centrifugal force capable of uprooting a young tree, and our narrative dagger, the leather jacket collar, creaked, stretched to the very limit of the material's strength, digging into Bruce's neck like a hangman's noose. The spectators, holding their breath, saw Bruce's feet leave the ground, and their brains had already painted the picture of the inevitable bloody finale, the flight along the arc, the crack of a spine against concrete, the triumph of raw mass over Eastern technique. There was such a monstrous inertia in that rotation that stopping it seemed impossible, like trying to stop an avalanche with your bare hands. The judoka was certain he controlled the situation because he felt the weight of Bruce's body hanging on his arm, but he had made a fatal, unforgivable mistake. He forgot that he only controlled the jacket, not the man inside it. Bruce Lee, suspended in the air in a state of momentary weightlessness, didn't panic or flail. He used this second of flight to take an ideal position unavailable to a person standing firmly on the ground. Do you expect him to try and punch the giant in the jaw or the groin? That would be logical, but useless against a mountain of muscle pumped with adrenaline. Bruce chose anatomy. His right hand, folded into the hard, bony form of a leopard's paw, shot upward with a short, explosive trajectory that the human eye could not track. The target wasn't the nose or the eyes. The target was a small, unprotected point on the giant's elbow joint, where the exposed ulnar nerve passes the electrical cable of the arm responsible for the grip. It was a strike of surgical precision, delivered at the moment of the opponent's maximum muscle tension, when they are most vulnerable to external impact. But that was only half of the execution, and this is where the moment of visual silence occurs, taking the breath away from the witnesses. Simultaneously with the hand strike, Bruce did something that contradicts the survival instinct. He didn't try to find support for landing. Instead, he used his right leg as a hammer. While his hand was shutting down the giant's nervous system from above, his foot, shod in a hard shoe, slammed with the force of a hydraulic press into the judoka's supporting leg shin, the single point upon which all 140 kilograms of weight and the inertia of the throw rested. Ask yourself, what happens to a tower if you simultaneously kick out the cornerstone and cut the electricity? The effect was instant and catastrophic. The nerve strike acted like a short circuit. A jolt of pain so intense shot through the champion's arm that his fingers, which had been gripping the collar, snapped open on their own, obeying not the owner's will, but the body's emergency protocol. The grip vanished, and the strike to the shin deprived him of his foundation. The rotation that was supposed to kill Bruce suddenly turned into an uncontrolled fall for the giant himself. In the judoka's eyes, which a second ago radiated triumph, a flash of animal terror ignited. He realized that his own strength, multiplied by gravity, was now working against him, and that he was falling into the abyss he had created. Bruce Lee, freed from the grip, landed softly on his feet like a cat, while his opponent, having lost all orientation in space, began to tumble backward, transforming from hunter into a victim of the laws of physics that Bruce used as his personal weapon. The effect of this double synchronized strike was instant and catastrophic, like a short circuit in a complex power grid when the switch is flipped without warning. In that split second, when the hard heel of Bruce Lee's palm slammed into the giant's ulnar nerve, it wasn't just a pain impulse that shot through the judoka's arm, but a literal 220-volt electrical discharge that paralyzed the limb's motor functions. You expect the giant to roar and tighten his grip? That would be logical in a battle of strength versus strength. But pure physiology took over, the fingers gripping our narrative dagger, the leather jacket collar, snapped open on their own, obeying not the owner's will but an emergency signal from the nervous system that simply cut the power to the muscles. The grip that a second ago could have throttled a bull vanished, and Bruce Lee, freed from his shackles, regained control over gravity, landing softly on his feet at the very moment his opponent began his relentless descent into hell. But that was only the beginning of the destruction. The second strike, a hard, chopping blow with the edge of his foot that Bruce delivered to the opponent's supporting leg, shin simultaneously with the arm attack, turned this fight into an architectural catastrophe. Imagine a skyscraper whose foundation has been destroyed by an explosion. It doesn't fall like a tree. It collapses into itself, losing shape and structure. 140 kilograms of live weight, deprived of support and coordination, slammed onto the polished terminal floor with a crash that silenced even the flight announcements over the loudspeakers. It wasn't the sound of a man falling. It was the sound of a sack of wet cement hitting the ground, dull, heavy, and final. The judoka didn't have time to break his fall or brace himself. His brain, overloaded with pain signals from two different points of his body, simply couldn't process the information that the horizon had flipped. He hit the concrete with his knee and shoulder, and a hoarse, stifled gasp escaped his chest. A mix of pain, shock, and total bewilderment at how the hunter had become the prey in half a second. And right here, at this point of absolute chaos, comes the moment of intellectual orgasm that forces you to rethink everything you knew about fighting. Bruce Lee didn't jump back to strike a pretty pose. He didn't start kicking the downed man. He did something much more terrifying and effective. He used the inertia of the enemy's fall to slide behind his back. While the giant, blinded by pain, tried to push himself up on all fours, Bruce was already behind him like a shadow. He softly, almost gently, placed his palm on the judoka's massive neck, but in that touch was a threat comparable to a pistol pressed to a temple. It was a gesture of total control. Bruce wasn't choking him. He simply signaled his presence, letting him know, "Your life belongs to me now, and I can take it with one movement if you flinch." A ringing, vacuum-like silence fell over the terminal. The members of the Japanese delegation, standing with mouths agape, couldn't believe their eyes. Their champion, their invincible colossus, was on his knees before a small man in civilian clothes, and that small man held a hand on the back of his head like a master holds a hand on the scruff of a misbehaving dog. The judoka froze. He felt the warmth of Bruce's palm on his neck. He felt the pulse in his numbed arm, and at that moment, his ego, inflated by years of victory, popped like a soap bubble. He realized he had lost, not because he was weaker, but because he was playing checkers with a grandmaster playing three-dimensional chess. Bruce leaned in toward his ear and whispered words that were heavier than any punch. "You are big, very big. But even the tallest house will fall if it has no foundation. Never grab what you cannot hold." The giant slowly turned his head, and in his eyes, usually full of aggression, there now swirled a superstitious terror. He looked at Bruce, not as an opponent, but as a natural disaster that could not be stopped by muscles. He realized that the electrical pain in his arm and the instant loss of balance were not a trick, but a demonstration of anatomical knowledge that bordered on magic. He tried to stand, but his legs still wouldn't obey, and he remained on his knees, bowing his head to the dragon in involuntary respect. Bruce Lee removed his hand from the man's neck, adjusted that same jacket collar that had just been a noose, and that simple, mundane gesture became the final point in the demonstration of his superiority. He walked away from a deadly encounter without even wrinkling his clothes, leaving the judo champion of Japan to ponder how 140 kilograms of force can become useless weight when pitted against pure speed and a knowledge of the human body's leverage. When Bruce Lee, with a careless, almost mundane motion, adjusted his leather jacket's lapels, returning that same damaged collar to its perfect state, something occurred in the Haneda Airport terminal that finally broke the onlooker's psyche. You expect the fallen giant, whose reputation was just ground into dust before his own delegation, to spring up in a berserker fit to wash away the shame with blood. That would be logical for a man used to solving problems with force. But here, the final Santa Barbara effect kicks in, transforming a street scuffle into a scene from a samurai epic. The judoka did not get up. Instead, overcoming the throbbing pain in his battered shin and numbed arm, he groaned and turned his massive body toward the retreating Bruce, and pressing his forehead against the cold terminal floor, performed a deep, respectful bow. It was an admission not just of defeat, but of an encounter with something beyond his understanding. Later, in an interview with Japanese newspapers, this champion would say a phrase that became legendary. "I didn't feel like I was fighting a man. When he touched me, it felt like a 220-volt electrical shock that shut down my body before my brain even had time to get scared." Bruce Lee walked toward the boarding gate, his gait light and springy, as if he hadn't just engaged in a struggle with a leviathan, but had simply been strolling through a park. He didn't look back. He didn't need applause or apologies, because for him, this incident wasn't a battle for honor. It was just another proof that physics works the same for everyone, regardless of bicep size. That very collar, our narrative dagger, which 5 minutes ago was a noose around his neck, had once again become just a detail of a stylish wardrobe. Hiding beneath it the marks of the monstrous pressure Bruce had endured without blinking an eye. There was so much cold majesty in his exit that the crowd parted before him like water before a ship, and in people's eyes there was a superstitious dread. They realized that the small actor from Hong Kong was not an on-screen image, but the most dangerous being in that building. However, this story from 1971 leaves us not with answers, but with a question that has torn the martial arts world apart for half a century, especially now in the era of the UFC and mixed martial arts. We saw a striker annihilate a grappler in 5 seconds, but let's be honest and apply some critical thinking. What if Bruce had missed the nerve cluster? What if the grip had been slightly tighter, and the giant had managed to complete the throw? In a real fight with no rules and no weight classes, the price of a mistake is your life. Bruce Lee put everything on the line, trusting his speed and anatomical knowledge, and he won. But this incident became fuel for an eternal debate. What is more effective in a deadly encounter? Look at the situation soberly. On one side, the grappler, a powerful wrestler who, if they grab you, will turn your bones to meal, using gravity and mass as a weapon. This is the power of a boa constrictor, from which there is no escape once you're in its coils. On the other side, the striker, a surgeon of violence who, like Bruce, bets on ending the fight before the opponent can realize their strength advantage, using speed and strikes to vulnerable points. This is the power of a cobra, whose bite is lethal, but who is vulnerable if caught. Whose side are you on in this war of philosophies? Do you believe that in a street fight to the death, the grip will always win because it cannot be evaded forever? Or are you convinced that the perfect strike, delivered at the speed of light to the right spot, renders any wrestling worthless? Who was Bruce that day? A genius who proved the superiority of striking technique, or a lucky man who escaped a deadly embrace due to his opponent's mistake? Write one word in the comments: grip or strike. I'll be waiting for your verdict, because in this choice lies your understanding of what true invincibility is, being an indestructible rock, or being the wind that destroys that rock.